The year is 1492. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus sailed west looking for a new route to Asia. He eventually landed in the Caribbean, an event history would forever call the discovery of the New World. Yet 500 years before the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria ever left port, another breed of mariner was already mastering the Atlantic. They hailed from the cold, fractured lands of Scandinavia. History calls them the Vikings. We typically remember them through the smoke of sacked monasteries, the flash of axes, and the terrified prayers of those who saw the dragon's head emerge from the mist. But the history books have actually done the Vikings a disservice. They weren't just raiders. They weren't merely barbarians. They were the most revolutionary seafarers of their age, driven by forces far more intricate than simple greed. They were explorers, entrepreneurs, lawgivers, and the unwitting cartographers of the globe. The true pioneers who redefined the global map long before any major European kingdom considered oceanic travel feasible. The story of the Vikings is not a footnote to Columbus, it is the prologue, and the key to their entire civilization, their vast influence, lies in a single elegant masterpiece of wood and iron, the Longship. To grasp their ambition, you must first understand the world that created them. Scandinavia in the 8th and 9th centuries was a land of scarcity and increasing political strife. Land was limited, and as powerful jarls, chiefs, began consolidating power, many free men faced a stark choice: submit to a king or seek fortune on the waves. This was the original call to the Vic, the journey to raid. But raiding quickly evolved into trade, and trade into permanent settlement. Their initial targets were the softer, richer kingdoms of the British Isles. The shocking raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne in 793 AD is often cited as the dawn of the Viking Age, a terrifying introduction to a new, brutal world order. Yet as they pillaged, they were observing, learning, and planning. They were always looking further. The forces driving this expansion were complex: demographics, wealth, and a simple craving for land. But regardless of the motivation, their reach was absolutely dependent on one critical factor: their ships. Without the revolutionary longship, the Vikings would have remained local skirmishers. Instead, they became the architects of a global network that stretched from the frigid Arctic Circle to the warm, bustling markets of Baghdad. We often picture these voyages as reckless, brute force ventures, but the sagas, the epic prose narratives recorded in Iceland, paint a very different picture. They speak of fear, reliance on nature, and an intimacy with the sea that modern sailors can barely grasp. This excerpt is not about triumph, it's about resilience. It speaks to the absolute trust placed in the Longship. This documentary will take you beyond the battle axe and into the blueprint. We will reveal the technological secrets that allowed the Vikings to navigate without a map, discover North America without a compass, and lay the foundation for nations far from their homeland. The true Viking Age was not defined by the conquest of kings, but by the conquest of the ocean itself. And that conquest began in the shipyards, with a revolutionary approach to shipbuilding that history had never witnessed. Let us explore the Longship Revolution. The Longship was not merely a vessel. It was a marvel of ancient engineering, a tool so perfectly adapted to its environment that it rendered the ships of other European powers obsolete for centuries. Its core innovation was its construction method, known as clinker-built or lap-strake. Instead of fitting planks edge to edge, as was common in the Mediterranean, Viking shipbuilders overlapped the thin wooden planks and riveted them together. This method achieved two critical things: flexibility. The overlapping planks created a hull that was supremely flexible. When faced with the towering swells of the North Atlantic, the Longship did not fight the wave, it bent and twisted with it, dispersing the immense pressure. A less flexible, carvel-built ship would have snapped under the stress. This is the secret to their oceanic resilience. Lightness. Because the boat's outer shell provided much of the strength, a heavy internal frame was unnecessary. This resulted in an incredibly light and fast ship for its size, capable of being rowed at high speeds, even against the wind. The Longship's signature feature, however, was its shallow draft. With a keel often measuring only 1 meter deep, a Viking ship could sail effortlessly across the open ocean, yet draw right up onto a beach, or navigate shallow, winding rivers deep inland. This gave the Vikings a devastating strategic advantage, allowing them to appear deep inside enemy territory, where no other ocean-going vessel could follow. The Longship came in various forms, tailored for specific missions. The Kavi, smaller vessels, often used for coastal raiding and local transport. The Snekya, the Snake, a common warship capable of carrying a crew of 40 to 50, long and fast for rapid assaults. The Drakkar, the largest and most fearsome, adorned with carved dragon heads, designed to intimidate and lead fleets. The Knar, not a warship, but the essential cargo vessel. Wider, deeper, and slower, the Knar was the backbone of their colonization efforts, carrying livestock, supplies, and settlers across the open sea. The propulsion system was equally brilliant. Every Longship used a single massive square sail, typically woven from wool and strengthened with leather straps. Crucially, the Vikings were masters of harnessing the wind. With the use of simple yet ingenious spars and ropes, the Beitas, they could sail remarkably close to the wind, a difficult maneuver known as tacking, which was highly advanced for their time. When the wind failed, the oars could be deployed instantly, allowing for rapid deployment or escape. But how did they navigate the terrifying, featureless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean without maps, compasses, or modern sextants? This is where the Vikings' mastery of the natural world became their primary technology. Their navigation secrets. Celestial and natural observation. Their primary tool was the sun and the stars. They sailed the well-known latitude routes, keeping the position of the sun and the pole star in mind. They paid obsessive attention to natural signs, the flight paths of seabirds, the smell of the air, the color of the water, and the direction of the swells. The solar compass, sun shadow board, archaeological evidence suggests the use of a wooden disc, a kind of sun compass, that allowed them to determine direction even on overcast days by observing the length and angle of shadows. The sunstone, Sunnestane. This legendary tool, perhaps a calcite crystal, may have allowed Viking navigators to pinpoint the sun's position and direction even when it was hidden by cloud cover or fog, leveraging the polarization of light. Imagine a Viking captain steering his knarr across the open sea, days or weeks out of sight of land. His survival depended on his knowledge, a vast inherited oral geography, and his acute senses. The sea was the color of lead, and the cloud cover stretched so low that the horizon was swallowed. The men could only hear the wind and the groan of the timbers, but the captain, he looked not at the water, but at the sky, holding the raven in his hand. If it flew high, land was far. If it turned, land was near. The raven itself was a navigational tool. Released far out to sea, if the bird flew out and failed to return, it meant it had found land. The captain would then follow its direction. This blend of simple physics, masterful engineering, and intimate natural knowledge transformed the Atlantic Ocean into what the Vikings would call the Atlantic Freeway. And once they mastered the tool, they were ready to take the next unbelievable step, colonizing the edge of the known world. With the Longship, the Vikings shattered the mental boundaries of the world. They sailed not just to raid, but to settle. Their colonization of the North Atlantic islands represents one of the most audacious and rapid expansions in history. Iceland, the anarchist republic, c. 870 AD. The first major leap was Iceland, discovered, according to legend, by accident. The settlement began in earnest after the unification of Norway under King Harald Fairhair. Many independent-minded jarls and landowners refused to submit to centralized authority. For them, Iceland was an escape, a place to found a new society based on their ancestral laws, free from kings. The journey was brutal. A few hundred miles of open ocean that broke the unprepared. But those who survived established a unique political entity, the Icelandic Commonwealth. It was a kind of anarchist republic, governed by an annual assembly, the Althing, which served as both a legislature and a supreme court. Here, far from any monarchy, Viking settlers created a sophisticated system of law and land division. Iceland became the cultural crucible of the Viking Age, the place where the sagas, the very stories that preserve their history, were eventually written down. But Iceland was merely a stepping stone. The true push into the unknown came with a name synonymous with ambition and violence: Eric the Red. Greenland, the Saga of Exile, c. 985 AD. The story of Greenland's discovery is a classic Viking tale of blood, banishment, and brilliant marketing. Eric Thorvaldsen, known as Eric the Red, was a man of immense physical and emotional power, and a magnet for trouble. Exiled from Norway for manslaughter, he settled in Iceland. But after committing another series of killings in Iceland, he was officially banished from the island for 3 years. He used his exile not for repentance, but for exploration. Based on the tales of a land sighted far to the west by an earlier explorer, Eric sailed west with his small crew, and he found a massive, desolate landmass primarily covered in ice, but with habitable fjords in the southwest. He spent his 3 years exploring this new territory, and when his term of banishment was complete, he returned to Iceland with the story of a new land. But he did not market it as the land of ice and rock. He called the country Greenland, for he said that people would be the more readily persuaded to go there if the land had a good name. This was a masterful stroke of medieval public relations. The name Greenland was a deliberate deception designed to lure desperate settlers and ensure the success of his colony.
In 985 AD, Eric the Red led a fleet of 25 ships from Iceland, carrying hundreds of settlers, livestock, and supplies. Only 14 ships survived the terrifying iceberg-ridden passage. They established two primary settlements, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. These colonies, despite the brutal environment, flourished for nearly 500 years, peaking at around 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants. Their survival was a testament to their resilience. They relied on a delicate ecological balance, farming in the protected fjords, hunting seals and whales, and trading valuable goods like walrus ivory with Europe. But the settlements in Greenland, perched on the absolute edge of the habitable world, led directly to the most earth-shattering discovery of all. The Vikings were not content to stop at Greenland. They were staring across a narrow strait at a vast, dark, forested landmass, a continent that history believed would remain unknown for another half millennium. The stage was set for Vinland. The first European to see the Americas was not Columbus, but a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who, like so many Vikings, simply got lost. Sailing from Iceland to Greenland in 986 AD, his ship was blown wildly off course by a storm. When the fog finally lifted, he saw not the rugged mountains of Greenland, but a flatter, forested land he was certain was not his destination. He refused to land, simply turning his ship north and east until he finally found Greenland. Bjarni's discovery was treated not as a momentous event, but as a navigational failure. He had seen a new world and turned back. But his stories and the sight of timber-rich land, a vital resource Greenland desperately lacked, fueled the imagination of Eric the Red's son, Leif Erikson. Leif was a man of destiny. He bought Bjarni's ship, gathered a crew of 35 men, and sailed west, reversing his father's course, determined to explore the unknown coast. He would find 3 distinct lands, each richer and more temperate than the last. He would name this final most promising land Vinland. He had discovered North America.
Leif Erikson's expedition around the year 1000 AD is the historical pivot point that confirms the Vikings as the first true European explorers of the New World. Sailing south and west from Greenland, Leif and his crew encountered the lands described in the sagas. Helluland, flat stone land, a bleak, flat and rocky coast, likely Baffinland in modern-day Canada. Markland, forest land, a heavily forested region that provided the precious timber Greenlanders craved, likely the coasts of Labrador. Vinland, wineland, the final, most inviting destination, a land of wild grapes, salmon-rich rivers, and a climate mild enough for long-term settlement. Modern archaeology places the main Viking foothold here at the northern tip of Newfoundland. Leif established a short-term base camp, built several houses, and named the area Vinland, probably due to the discovery of wild berries or grapes. He returned to Greenland a hero, having found the timber and resources that guaranteed his colony's future. But the story does not end with Leif. The most significant attempt at colonization was led by Thorfinn Karlsefni, a wealthy Icelandic merchant. Determined to establish a permanent colony, Karlsefni sailed for Vinland with a massive expedition, 3 ships carrying 160 settlers, including women and livestock, establishing the first European family unit in the Americas. They settled in a place called Hope, a tidal lagoon that provided ample fishing. The unshakable proof, Lance Ox Meadows. For centuries, the tale of Vinland was dismissed as mere folklore, a fanciful story of a distant mythic land. That changed in 1960. At a place called Landsaks Meadows on the northernmost tip of Newfoundland, archaeologists Helge and Arnstein Ingstad discovered the undeniable, the ruins of a small Norse settlement, the remains of 8 timber-framed buildings, a blacksmith forge, and distinctively Norse artifacts like a spindle whorl used for weaving and a bronze pin were unearthed. This discovery was a hammer blow to conventional history. Radiocarbon dating and more recently tree ring analysis of wood cut at the site has confirmed the settlement's existence to a precise date of 1021 AD. The Vikings were indeed here. But the settlement was short-lived. The sagas vividly describe the reason for their ultimate retreat: conflict with the local inhabitants. The Vikings called them Skrælings, meaning wretches or screamers, a term applied to the Dorset, Thule, and other indigenous groups of the region. The initial encounters involved trade. The Skrælings exchanged furs for Viking milk and red cloth. The Skrælings came down upon them in a great host, screaming savagely. The Vikings retreated, terrified, believing they were surrounded by enemies they could not understand. A great cry went up when the Skrælings' war machines, slings, struck a Viking, and the sound was so fearsome that they fled in disarray. The Vikings' military technology, their iron weapons, was superior, but the sheer numbers and relentless hostility of the indigenous groups, combined with the extreme distance from their Greenland supply lines, proved insurmountable. The settlers were constantly forced into defensive fighting, unable to farm or hunt effectively. After only a few years, Karlsefni packed his ships and retreated, taking with him his infant son Snorri, who was the first European child born in the Americas. The failure of Vinland was not of navigation or technology, but of logistics and social conflict. It was simply too far, too costly, and too dangerous to maintain a permanent presence. The true tragedy of Vinland was that its existence was forgotten. With no permanent colony, the discovery became an oral memory, preserved only in the remote sagas of Iceland. When the climate in Greenland worsened centuries later, the Norse colonies there eventually died out, cutting the final link between the Viking world and the continent they discovered. While one group was pushing west into the ice, another group of Vikings, the Swedes, was charting a radically different, equally consequential path toward the wealth of the East. When the Danish and Norwegian Vikings looked west, seeking plunder and land across the open ocean, the Swedish Vikings, known as the Rus or Varangians, looked east. Their ambition was not the cold gold of monasteries, but the shimmering silk and Arab silver of Constantinople and Baghdad. The Eastern Viking expansion was not defined by the longship, but by its close relative, the shallow draft river vessel, and a strategy built entirely on trade routes, an elaborate system of river highways, the great river systems. The Varangians infiltrated the vast, dense forests of Eastern Europe, modern-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, by mastering 2 massive river systems. The Volga trade route. This route took them from the Baltic Sea down the Volga River to the Caspian Sea, connecting them directly with the Abbasid Caliphate and the Persian world. The primary currency here was silver dirhams, mined in the east. The Dnieper route, the route from the Varangians to the Greeks. This was the more historically consequential route. It plunged south through vast forests and across treacherous rapids, eventually emptying into the Black Sea and leading directly to Constantinople, the glittering capital of the Byzantine Empire, which the Vikings called Miklagard, the Great City. These river journeys were a logistical nightmare. The boats were often dragged overland, a process called portaging, to bypass rapids and connect different river systems. The sagas and historical accounts describe constant threats from hostile tribes and the terrifying prospect of navigating the 7 great rapids of the Dnieper. The commodity that fueled this entire enterprise was not just plunder, but fur, sable, mink, and tragically, slaves, Slavs, whom they traded for Arab silver, Byzantine silk, and wine. Constantinople and the Varangian Guard. The climax of the Eastern journey was Constantinople, a city that instantly dwarfed anything the Vikings had ever known. The Byzantines, while wary of the Norse traders, recognized their exceptional fighting skills. This led to the formation of the legendary Varangian Guard. Initially recruited as mercenaries, the Varangian Guard quickly became the elite imperial bodyguard of the Byzantine emperors. Clad in heavy armor and wielding their signature two-handed battle axes, they were prized for their loyalty, since they had no local political ties, and their utter ferocity in battle. They were essentially the finest, best-paid soldiers in the ancient world. These men, fierce, silent, and deadly, stood watch at the emperor's side. They were the thunder that followed the lightning. The sound of their axes was often the last thing an enemy of the empire ever heard. The wealth they accumulated, gold, jewels, and enormous pay, often found its way back to Scandinavia, evidenced by the vast hoards of Byzantine coins and artifacts found buried in Swedish soil. The founding of Rus. Most importantly, the Swedish Vikings did not just trade, they built nations. According to the primary chronicle, the foundational history of the region, the local Slavic tribes eventually invited the Varangian chief Rurik to rule over them and bring order. Rurik established his base at Novgorod, and his successors, most notably Oleg, expanded south, capturing Kiev. This unification of the river systems under Norse leadership marked the founding of Kievan Rus, the direct cultural and political ancestor of modern Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Viking legacy in the East was thus of state-building and cultural assimilation, a profound contrast to their temporary raids in the West. They transitioned from raiders to rulers, permanently shaping the geography and identity of Eastern Europe. By the early 11th century, the Viking global blueprint was complete. They had explored more of the planet than any other European people. They had settled Iceland, colonized Greenland, reached the shores of North America, traded deep into the Middle East, and founded a powerful state in the East. Yet, by the year 1200, the Viking Age was effectively over. What caused the collapse of this colossal, decentralized expansion? The rise of kingdoms. The very forces that drove the initial expansion, fragmented power, were reversed. Scandinavia itself consolidated into the Christian kingdoms of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. The kings needed the jarls to fight for them, not for independent glory on the waves. The Longships were repurposed for centralized royal fleets. Conversion to Christianity. The adoption of Christianity across Scandinavia brought the region into the European political and cultural mainstream. Monastic raiding stopped, and trade became regulated by Christian law, replacing plunder with diplomacy. The aggressive pagan lifestyle of the Vikinger was deemed unacceptable. The Little Ice Age. The most devastating factor was climate change. Beginning around the 13th century, the world entered a period of cooling. The crucial trade route from Greenland to North America became choked with ice, and Greenland's fragile settlements, dependent on maritime trade, were starved of resources. By the early 15th century, the Greenland colonies vanished. The physical link to Vinland was gone. The stories of Leif Erikson were relegated to tales written on dried animal skin in the isolated language of Iceland, unheard by the ambitious scholars and merchants of southern Europe. When Columbus sailed in 1492, he was sailing for Spain, powered by the vast capital and geographical knowledge of the Mediterranean world. He had an imperial apparatus and a financial engine behind him. The Vikings had only the strength of their ships and the determination of individual families. The Vikings' discovery was not forgotten by them, but by the rest of the world. It failed to integrate into the global consciousness because they lacked a centralized literate empire like Rome or Spain to record and exploit the discovery. Their colonies were too isolated and lacked the military or demographic strength to survive the local environment and population. Their focus shifted back east towards internal nation-building, Rus, and service to the Byzantine Empire, leaving the far-flung Atlantic colonies to fend for themselves against an implacable climate. The enduring legacy of the Vikings is not the bloodshed in Lindisfarne, but the scale of their ambition. They were the first people to connect 4 separate continents, Europe, Asia, North America, and possibly Africa, through their contacts in the Caliphate, into a single crude global network. The Longship remains the greatest testament to their ingenuity, an engineering masterpiece that transformed the oceans from an impassable barrier into a vast open highway. They proved that the world was far larger and the sea far less formidable than anyone had dared to imagine. The history of exploration did not begin with the Renaissance. It began with the roar of a dragon head cutting through the icy waves, carried by the hands of the intrepid, forgotten cartographers of the North. This was the Viking blueprint, and it redefined the map of humanity forever.